8 men came with power. Only 1 man came with control. When he closed the paper, Harlem stopped breathing.
Harlem, 1943, February, just after midnight. The Lenox Club on 147th Street is loud tonight. Piano music, smoke hanging in the air, people drinking like tomorrow doesn't exist. But in the back booth, nobody's drinking. 8 men sit on one side of the table, well-dressed, Italian, not from around here. On the other side, 1 man sits alone. He's reading a newspaper, hasn't looked up yet. The 8 men wait. One of them shifts in his seat. Another lights a cigarette, but his hand moves too quick. Nervous. The man with the newspaper turns a page, still hasn't looked at them. 4 minutes pass, maybe 5. Finally, he folds the paper. Sets it down carefully, lines it up with the edge of the table. Now he looks. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy they called him, 37 years old. A bump on the back of his head since childhood gave him the name, but that's not why people remembered it. The 8 men have come with a message from downtown. From men who control docks and unions, politicians and police precincts. Men who have decided Harlem's been independent long enough. What happens in the next 11 minutes will determine who runs Harlem for the next 20 years. But to understand why 8 men were sent, you need to understand what Bumpy Johnson had built. And more importantly, how he'd learned to build it. Charleston, South Carolina, 1915. A 10-year-old boy watches his older brother Willie get accused of something. The details don't matter. What matters is the crowd forming outside and the way his mother starts packing in the middle of the night. 3 days later, the family's on a train heading north. The boy doesn't ask questions. He's already learning that some things don't require explanation. By the time he's 15, he's in Harlem, living with his sister, learning the rhythms of 135th Street, the pool rooms, the storefronts. The way certain men walk and others move out of the way. He's small. Southern accent makes him stand out. Kids pick on him. He picks back. Harder. There's a man named Bub Hewlett who runs protection for the Numbers bankers. Small operations but steady money. One afternoon he watches this teenager refuse to back off his corner when Bub's crew tells him to move. Most kids would have run. This one squared up. Bub saw something. Maybe not what the kid would become, but enough. He offered him work. By 1928, Bumpy Johnson was no longer the skinny kid from Charleston. He was 22, had done 2 stints in reform school, and was known as someone you didn't test. More importantly, he'd learned to think. Not just about the job in front of him, but 3 jobs ahead, who benefited, who lost, who would remember. That's when he met Stephanie St. Clair. She called herself the Queen of Harlem. Some people laughed at the title, but not to her face and never twice. St. Clair ran the numbers, multiple operations across Harlem, made more money in a week than most men saw in a year. She was French West Indian, sharp as a razor, and had no intention of asking permission from anyone. She looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw what Bub Hewlett had seen years earlier. But she saw more. In 1931, she made him her enforcer. This was the arrangement. She handled the money, the strategy, the politics. He handled everything else. For 3 years, it worked perfectly. Then Dutch Schultz decided Harlem belonged to him. Arthur Flegenheimer, that was his real name, German-Jewish, ran bootlegging in the Bronx until prohibition started dying and he needed new income. The numbers racket in Harlem was pulling in millions. Schultz looked at those millions and saw them as his. The fact that black operators had built the business from nothing, that the community trusted them, that Harlem had its own economy, none of that meant anything to Schultz. He sent his men in 1931, told the Numbers bankers they now worked for him. Anyone who refused would be handled. Stephanie St. Clair refused. What followed was a war that would last 4 years and claim over 40 lives. But it wasn't fought the way people expected. Schultz had more men, more guns, more connections to Tammany Hall and the police. Direct confrontation was suicide, so Bumpy Johnson didn't fight directly. He fought like someone who knew he couldn't afford to lose. Schultz's collectors would disappear, not killed, just gone. Found 3 days later in Jersey, no memory of how they got there. Schultz's drop points would get raided by police. Not the ones Schultz paid off, different ones. Ones who suddenly got anonymous tips about where and when. Schultz's men would walk into ambushes that didn't look like ambushes. Wrong place, wrong time, no witnesses, it was a guerrilla war. Schultz couldn't grab hold of it. Every time he thought he knew where Johnson was somewhere else. By 1935, Schultz was losing ground in Harlem, losing money, and losing his mind over it. October 23, 1935. Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Dutch Schultz sits at a table with 3 of his men. They're talking about Harlem, about Johnson, about how to end this thing. 2 men walk in. They don't say anything. 4 shots. 5. Schultz dies the next day in the hospital. Never says who gave the order, though the word on the street is Charles Luciano made the call. Schultz was causing problems, not just in Harlem. Everywhere, so they handled it. When Stephanie St. Clair heard the news, she sent Schultz a telegram at the hospital. It read, "As ye sow, so shall you reap." But with Schultz dead, Harlem had a new problem. The Italian families had removed Schultz. That meant they now considered Harlem an open question. The numbers racket was still there, still profitable, and now nobody was in the way. In early 1936, Charles Luciano sent word to Bumpy Johnson. A meeting, just to talk. The 2 men met in front of the YMCA on 135th Street, neutral ground, public. Luciano laid it out simply. The Italians could have sent an army into Harlem, could have taken everything. But that would be messy, expensive, bad for business. Instead, he proposed a deal. The Harlem numbers operators keep their independence. They run their own operations, make their own decisions, but they pay a percentage to the Italians. Call it a tax, call it protection, call it whatever makes sense. In exchange, no one touches Harlem, no more Dutch Schultz situations. Bumpy Johnson listened, didn't agree immediately, didn't refuse either. He asked one question, who runs Harlem? Luciano smiled, said, you do. The deal was made. It would last for 30 years, but not everyone liked it. By 1943, Bumpy Johnson had become something unprecedented in New York. A black man with real power, not symbolic, not limited to his neighborhood, real. He controlled all significant numbers operations in Harlem. He settled disputes. He decided who could operate and who couldn't. He walked into any club, any restaurant, any social club in Harlem, and people stood up. More than that, the Italians treated him as an equal. Not as an employee, not as a subordinate, as a partner. That bothered some people downtown. There was a faction, younger guys mostly, who thought the arrangement was insulting. A black gangster taking a cut, making decisions, acting like he had the same authority they did. They thought it needed to be corrected. So they sent 8 men to the Lenox Club in February 1943 to explain the new terms. The 8 men sitting across from Bumpy Johnson weren't soldiers. They were made guys, respected, connected to families with real weight. That was the first message. This wasn't a negotiation with underlings. This was serious. The second message came in what they said. The man in the middle, his name doesn't matter now, laid it out. The arrangement with Luciano was old. Times had changed. Harlem was bigger now, more valuable. The new terms. Bumpy still runs the day-to-day, but the percentage goes up. Way up. And any major decisions get approved first. Meaning, you work for us now. Bumpy Johnson didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just listened. When the man finished, Bumpy nodded slowly, like he was considering it, then he asked if they wanted drinks. On the house. The 8 men looked at each other. This wasn't the response they expected. Bumpy signaled to the bartender. Drinks came. All 8 men took them. Would have been disrespectful not to. They drank. Bumpy didn't. He stood up, slowly, took his coat from the back of the chair. He said 6 words. Tell them Harlem ain't for sale. Then he walked out. The 8 men sat there, confused, angry, but mostly confused. They'd been sent to deliver a message, and instead they'd been dismissed. Politely, but dismissed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known sitting in that booth, was that while they were in the Lennox Club, 3 phone calls had been made. One to Charles Luciano's people in Manhattan, one to Frank Costello's operation on the West Side, one to Vito Genovese's crew in Little Italy. The message in those calls was simple: a situation is developing. You might want to know about it. By the time the 8 men left the Lennox Club and got back downtown, their bosses already knew what happened. And those bosses were not happy, not with Bumpy Johnson, with them. The arrangement with Johnson wasn't some handshake between friends. It was a carefully structured business deal that had kept Harlem stable and profitable for almost a decade. It had been approved at the highest levels. And 8 guys made guys but still had just tried to renegotiate it without authorization. One of the 8 disappeared 2 weeks later. Nobody asked where he went. The others were told clearly that the arrangement with Bumpy Johnson would not be changing. Not now, not ever. Harlem would remain independent as long as the deal was honored, and the deal would be honored. This is where the story gets complicated, because depending on who told it later, it changed. Some versions said the 8 men never left the Lennox Club, that there was violence, that bodies were found. Other versions said Bumpy Johnson went to war with the Italians for 6 months and won. Neither was true. The truth was quieter, more bureaucratic, less dramatic, but the effect was the same. After February 1943, no one tried to renegotiate Bumpy Johnson's arrangement again. What actually happened was this. The men who sent the 8 guys to Harlem, the younger faction who thought Johnson needed to be put in his place, they'd made a miscalculation. They assumed the older bosses wouldn't care, that it was a minor issue, that nobody important would object to squeezing more money out of Harlem. But Bumpy Johnson had spent years building relationships, not just with Luciano, with everyone who mattered. He played chess with Luciano in front of the YMCA not once, regularly. They talked about books, about politics, about philosophy. He had dinners with Frank Costello. Talked business, but also talked about the neighborhood, about respect, about how to keep things stable. He understood something that the younger guys didn't. Power isn't just about force, it's about relationships, trust, predictability. The Italians knew that if they broke the deal with Johnson, Harlem would destabilize. And a destabilized Harlem meant chaos, violence, lost revenue, and police attention. Johnson made himself indispensable, not through threats, through competence. So when the 8 men showed up trying to change terms, they weren't just challenging Johnson, they were challenging a decade of careful diplomacy. The bosses chose the diplomacy. After that night, certain things in Harlem changed, subtly, but everyone noticed. Bumpy Johnson started showing up at Italian social clubs downtown, not as a guest, as someone who belonged. He'd walk in, shake hands, sit at tables with men whose names appeared in newspapers. And nobody questioned it. The younger guys who'd wanted to correct the situation, they stopped getting invited to important meetings. Their opinions stopped mattering. One of them tried to make noise about it, complained that a black gangster had more access than made guys. He was told to shut up. When he didn't, he was sent to Florida to handle a situation that didn't exist. He stayed there for 3 years. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson had won something more valuable than a fight. He'd won institutional protection, but winning created its own problems. By the late 1940s, Bumpy Johnson was untouchable in Harlem. He controlled the numbers, controlled distribution networks, controlled access. He was also getting attention from the federal government. The FBI opened a file on him in 1946, not because he was black, though that didn't help, because he represented something they didn't understand. A black man with power in organized crime wasn't supposed to exist. The Mafia was supposed to be Italian, period. The fact that Johnson operated as an equal partner, that he had autonomy, that he made decisions without permission, it broke their model. So they started watching closely. In 1951, Johnson was arrested for heroin distribution. The evidence was thin, the arrest felt targeted. He was sentenced to 15 years, sent to Alcatraz. Before he left, he had a conversation with Frank Costello. Nobody knows what was said, but when Johnson went to prison, his operations in Harlem continued running smoothly. His wife, Mame, handled some of it. Trusted lieutenants handled the rest. And the Italian families made sure nobody interfered. That was the deal. Even when Johnson was gone, the deal remained. He spent 11 years in Alcatraz, read constantly, wrote poetry. Some of it got published in Harlem magazines. Inmates who served time with him said he was different from other gangsters. Quiet, educated, dangerous in a way that didn't require volume. In June 1962, 3 inmates escaped from Alcatraz. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. They were never found. Rumors spread that Johnson helped arrange it, that he had connections on the outside, that a boat was waiting, that he orchestrated the only successful escape in Alcatraz history. Johnson never confirmed it, never denied it either. When asked years later, he just smiled. June 1963, Bumpy Johnson walks out of prison. He's 57 years old, has been gone for 11 years. When he gets back to Harlem, there's a parade, not organized, spontaneous. People line the streets, they want to see him, want to welcome him home, but Harlem isn't the same place he left. The neighborhood is flooded with heroin. The Italian families, the same ones who'd honored the deal for decades, had allowed drugs to pour into Harlem while Johnson was gone. Maybe it was deliberate, maybe it was just business. Either way, it happened. Johnson looked at what his neighborhood had become and felt something he hadn't felt in years: betrayal. He met with his old contacts downtown, asked what happened, why the deal didn't include keeping heroin out. They told him the truth. The deal was about the numbers racket. Heroin was different business, different people. Johnson realized the landscape had shifted. The rules he'd fought for in the 1940s didn't cover the 1960s. He had a choice: adapt or become irrelevant. He chose to adapt. For the next 5 years, Johnson ran Harlem the same way he always had, with discipline, with strategy. With an understanding that power is about relationships, not just force. He also reconnected with an old friend, Malcolm Little, Detroit Red, now known as Malcolm X. They'd known each other since the 1940s when Malcolm was hustling on the streets. Johnson had looked out for him back then, gave him advice, kept him from getting killed. Now Malcolm was a national figure, Nation of Islam. A powerful speaker, advocating for black self-determination. In 1964, Malcolm split from the nation. He knew there would be consequences. He asked Johnson for protection. Johnson assigned men to watch Malcolm, keep him safe. But Malcolm told him to pull them back, said it wasn't good for his image to be associated with a known criminal. Johnson pulled his men back. 2 weeks later, February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom. Johnson attended the funeral, didn't say much, but people who saw him that day said he looked older, tired, like he'd lost something he couldn't get back. July 7, 1968, just after 2 a.m. Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street, a place Johnson had been coming to for 30 years. He's sitting with friends, eating fried chicken, laughing about something from the old days. Then he stops laughing, grabs his chest. His friend Junie Bayed catches him as he falls forward. Bumpy Johnson dies in Bayed's arms, heart attack. He's 62 years old. The funeral is held 3 days later. Thousands of people show up. Harlem shuts down for it. Police station, sharpshooters on rooftops surrounding the church, shotguns visible. Mame Johnson looks up at them and almost laughs. She thinks they're expecting him to get up and start trouble. Even dead, they're afraid of him. Among the mourners are faces from downtown. Made guys, some of them elderly now. They came to pay respects, not because they liked Bumpy Johnson. Some did, some didn't. They came because he'd earned it. In the years after Johnson's death, stories began to spread. Some true, some exaggerated, some completely invented. People said he'd killed hundreds of men, that he'd outsmarted the entire Italian mafia, that he'd been more powerful than any mob boss in New York. None of that was accurate, but the truth was impressive enough. Bumpy Johnson had done what no other black gangster in America had done. He'd negotiated power as an equal with the Italian mafia and maintained that equality for 30 years. He hadn't done it through violence, though he was capable of violence. He'd done it through intelligence, discipline, relationships. He understood that power isn't about how much force you can apply, it's about how much force you don't have to apply. The 8 men who came to the Lenox Club in 1943 learned that. They came expecting confrontation, expecting Johnson to fight, to threaten, to prove himself. Instead, he dismissed them, and in doing so made them irrelevant. That was the lesson Bumpy Johnson taught, whether intentionally or not. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who make noise. They're the ones who make a phone call. By 1970, Harlem was changing again. The neighborhood Johnson had fought for was fracturing under the weight of drugs, poverty, and urban renewal policies that destroyed as much as they built. The numbers racket, the business that Johnson and St. Clair had defended in the 1930s, was being replaced by state lotteries. Legal gambling. The same game, but now the government ran it. Some of the old-timers in Harlem would talk about Johnson. Quietly, carefully, they'd mention the time he walked out of the Lenox Club and 8 made guys just sat there, or the arrangement he'd built with Luciano, or the way he'd commanded respect without demanding it, but they wouldn't say too much. Even years after his death, there was a sense that some stories belonged to the people who lived them. In the 1990s, a man named Frank Lucas claimed he'd been Johnson's driver and protege, that he'd taken over Johnson's operation after his death, that he'd built a heroin empire using Johnson's connections. Mame Johnson called it a lie, said Lucas was barely around during Johnson's final years, that he'd inflated his relationship with Bumpy to sell his own legend. She was probably right. But the fact that Lucas needed to attach himself to Johnson's name, that he couldn't tell his own story without borrowing Johnson's credibility, that said something. It said that decades after his death, Bumpy Johnson's name still carried weight, still meant something. The Lenox Club, where the 8 men came to deliver their message, closed in 1973. The building was torn down in 1981. Wells Restaurant, where Johnson died, lasted until 1987. The YMCA on 135th Street, where Johnson and Luciano played chess, is still there. Different now, but there. If you stand in front of it, you can almost picture 2 men sitting on the steps, one Italian, one black, playing chess, talking about things that had nothing to do with crime. 2 men who understood that the game wasn't about the pieces on the board. It was about knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to make the other player think you had more pieces than you did. The Italian mafia tried to take Harlem in 1943. They sent 8 men to make it happen. They failed. Not because Bumpy Johnson fought them, because he'd already won. He'd built something they couldn't dismantle without destroying their own interests. He'd made himself essential, irreplaceable. That's a kind of power that doesn't require violence, doesn't require threats. It just requires patience, intelligence, and an understanding that the most important battles are won before anyone realizes they're fighting. The 8 men who walked into the Lenox Club that night learned something they'd never forget. Some people don't need to declare war. They've already won it.